My name is Nicholas, I'm 38, and for 7 years, I believed I was married to a devoted art curator who loved our quiet life on the Oregon coast. But last Sunday, in our dimly lit living room, Julianne handed me a glass of whiskey, her fingers trembling slightly. That single, nervous tremor was the spark that set my entire world on fire. What did she hide behind her loving smiles? $80,000 siphoned from our accounts, secret late-night texts to my rival, and a blueprint to ruin my business. In just 72 hours, my perfect marriage disintegrated into a legal nightmare that stripped me of everything. And the architect of my ruin? Julianne, who sat there calmly humming while folding the laundry, completely unaware that her empire of lies was about to bury us both. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. The rain against the panoramic windows of our coastal Oregon home sounded like 1,000 tiny fingers scratching at the glass, trying to find a way inside. It was a Sunday night, the kind of quiet, suffocating evening where the silence between two people becomes a physical presence in the room. I sat in the leather armchair by the fireplace, watching the flames lick the damp pine logs, casting long, distorted shadows across the polished concrete floor. Julianne had been watching me all evening with a quiet, predatory intensity, her eyes tracking my every movement as if trying to read the thoughts I had spent the last several weeks carefully burying beneath a mask of absolute normalcy. She knew something had shifted, even if she could not put her finger on it. To break the tension, she had slipped away to the bedroom, returning a few minutes later wrapped in a dark emerald silk robe that clung to her curves in a way that had once made my heart skip a beat. In her hands, she carried 2 heavy crystal glasses filled with 2 fingers of single malt whiskey, the ice clinking softly against the glass. She walked over to me with a slow, deliberate grace, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. She did not ask if I wanted a drink, she simply pressed one glass into my hand and sank onto my lap, her body warm and fragrant with the scent of expensive jasmine and rain. Her fingers, cool and slender, found their way into the hair at the nape of my neck, gently pulling my face toward hers. She whispered that she had missed me, her voice a soft, trembling purr that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken lies. I felt a sudden, violent wave of revulsion rise in my throat, a physical rejection of the woman who had shared my bed for 7 years while secretly planning my ruin. But I forced my muscles to relax, leaning into her touch, letting my lips meet hers in a kiss that was as desperate as it was hollow. The intimacy that followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Julianne poured every ounce of her charm and physical allure into the encounter, using her body as a shield to disarm my suspicions and reassert her control over me. She moved against me with a feverish, calculated warmth, whispering promises of our future, of the trips we would take and the life we would continue to build together. I played my part perfectly, matching her intensity, letting her believe that her power over me was absolute, that a few hours of physical surrender could erase the cold distance of the past weeks. It was an exhausting, agonizing performance, but as I held her tight against me, I kept my eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling and counting the seconds until it would be over. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the storm outside had settled into a steady, rhythmic drone, and Julianne lay beside me in a deep, exhausted sleep, her breathing slow and even. The room was dark, save for the dying embers of the fire. I slid out from the heavy down comforter with agonizing slowness, making sure not to disturb her. I stood over her for a long moment, looking down at the soft curve of her shoulder and the pale skin of her neck where the platinum sapphire collar usually rested. Gently, with the precision of a surgeon, I reached down and lifted her limp right hand, pressing her thumb against the biometric sensor of her phone resting on the nightstand. The screen flared to life, illuminating her sleeping face in a pale, ghostly blue light. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I quickly navigated to her secure messaging apps and financial portals, copying the encrypted logs and wire transfer receipts to a small, high-capacity drive I had prepared. The numbers on the screen confirmed my worst fears. She had already transferred $80,000 of our joint investment funds to an offshore holding company controlled by Carter Sterling. I stared at the digital trail of her betrayal, the cold weight of reality settling heavily in my chest as I realized the woman sleeping peacefully beside me had already begun the process of tearing our life apart. The gray, watery light of Monday morning filtered through the towering Douglas firs, casting a cold pallor over our bedroom. When Julianne stirred beside me, stretching her limbs with the lazy satisfaction of a predator that had successfully defended its territory, I was already awake. I had been awake for hours, my eyes fixed on the ceiling while the digital ghost of her betrayal burned behind my eyelids. She rolled over, her face soft with sleep, and reached out to touch my chest. Her fingers traced a slow circle over my heart, and she smiled, a warm, victorious expression that told me she believed her performance of the previous night had worked perfectly. I forced myself to look down at her, to smile back, and to press a gentle kiss to her forehead before slipping out of bed. I told her I had an early meeting with a concrete supplier in Astoria, a lie that slipped past my lips with terrifying ease. 30 minutes later, I was in my truck, the heater blasting against the damp morning chill, with the small silver flash drive heavy in my coat pocket. I did not drive to Astoria. Instead, I went to my private office at the edge of the shipyard, a quiet, corrugated metal building where the scent of sawdust and diesel fuel always grounded me. I locked the door, pulled the blinds, and booted up my laptop. When I plugged in the drive, the sheer volume of the stolen data stared back at me in cold, monochrome folders. I spent the next 4 hours reading through 3 years of my wife's secret life. The text messages between Julianne and Carter Sterling were not just romantic, they were transactional. Carter was drowning. His ambitious resort project on the Columbia River had collapsed under the weight of municipal lawsuits, and his personal debts had ballooned to over $2 million. His wife, Eleanor, whose family controlled the largest real estate trust in the Pacific Northwest, kept him on a notoriously short leash. If Eleanor discovered his financial instability, she would invoke their ironclad prenuptial agreement and strip him of his partnership at the firm. Julianne had become his financial lifeline, quietly siphoning $80,000 from our joint accounts over the last 6 months to cover his interest payments, hiding the transactions under the guise of art acquisitions for the gallery. The desperation in Carter's messages was palpable, a stark contrast to the polished, arrogant man I had seen at charity galas. He begged her for more, promising that once the Sterling Marina project launched, they would run away together. Julianne's replies were fiercely protective, filled with assurances that I was too blind and too trusting to ever notice the missing funds. I sat back in my chair, the hum of the computer fan the only sound in the quiet room. The pain of her betrayal had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. I knew that a standard divorce court would take months, perhaps years, and under our state laws, she would still fight to take half of my business. I needed to bypass the slow grind of the legal system and strike at the very foundation of her existence. I began organizing the files into 3 distinct digital packages. The first was addressed to the board of directors at the Sterling Gallery, detailing Julianne's embezzlement of gallery resources to shield Carter's debts. The second was prepared for the local press, containing high-resolution photographs of their late-night encounters at the gallery. But the third package, the one I assembled with the most meticulous care, was addressed to Eleanor Sterling. It contained every bank statement, every wire transfer, and every desperate text message showing exactly how my wife had been using our money to keep Eleanor's husband afloat. The grand opening of the Sterling Marina project was scheduled for Thursday night, just 3 days away. It would be the largest gathering of the city's wealthy elite, the perfect stage for a public execution. I sealed the digital files, encrypted them, and prepared the physical couriers to deliver the packages at precisely 7 o'clock on Thursday evening. As I closed my laptop, the rain outside began to fall again, washing over the gravel parking lot, and for the first time in months, I felt a deep, quiet sense of peace. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for them to step into it. The 72 hours leading up to the exhibition were a masterclass in structural integrity. In my line of work as an architectural landscaper, you learn very quickly that you cannot build anything lasting on a foundation of shifting clay. When you realize a massive retaining wall is beginning to fail, you do not immediately run to it with a sledgehammer and tear it down in a fit of anger. If you do, the entire hillside will slide down and bury you alive. Instead, you study the cracks. You map the hydrostatic pressure building up behind the concrete. You calculate the exact point of maximum tension, and you wait for the precise moment to let gravity do the work for you. Living with Julianne during those 3 days felt exactly like standing beneath a collapsing cliffside, pretending the dust falling on my shoulders was nothing more than a light summer breeze. I spent my days at a job site in Gerhardt, working alongside my crew to install a series of massive basalt terraces designed to hold back the encroaching coastal dunes. The physical labor was brutal, my hands calloused and stained with dark soil, my muscles aching from the weight of the stone. It was an honest, unforgiving kind of work, a stark contrast to the sterile, air-conditioned world of high art that Julianne inhabited. When I returned home each evening, I had to wash the mud from my skin and step into the role of the quiet, unassuming husband, a man who was supposedly too simple to understand the complex financial maneuvers happening right under his nose. Julianne was a whirlwind of nervous, electric energy during those final days. The grand opening of the Sterling Marina project was to be the crowning achievement of her career as a curator, a multi-million-dollar exhibition that would solidify her standing among the cultural elite of the Pacific Northwest. She spent hours pacing the length of our living room, her phone constantly buzzing with encrypted messages from Carter Sterling. I would watch her from the kitchen island as she stepped out onto the cedar deck, her voice dropping to a breathless, urgent whisper against the backdrop of the crashing ocean waves. I caught fragments of those conversations, words like liquidity, collateral, and timeline. I knew exactly what they were discussing. They were not just planning an art show, they were managing the quiet, systematic transfer of my life savings into Carter's failing real estate empire. Yet, when we sat down for dinner, she was the picture of the devoted, supportive wife. On Wednesday evening, she sat across from me, picking at a salad of wild greens, and lectured me on my lack of ambition. She told me I should try to be more like Carter, a man who understood the grand scale of things, a man who was present and engaged with the world. I simply smiled, stirred my coffee with deliberate slowness, and agreed with her. I told her that she was absolutely right, and that I was looking forward to showing my appreciation for everything Carter had done for her career. She did not notice the cold, sharp edge in my voice. She was too blinded by her own arrogance, too convinced that her simple husband was nothing more than a reliable paycheck with legs. When Thursday finally arrived, the coastal weather seemed to mirror the heavy, suffocating anticipation settling in my chest. The morning rain had washed the sky into a pale, bruised shade of slate, and the wind off the Pacific carried the sharp, metallic tang of an incoming storm. Julianne spent the entire afternoon preparing for the evening, transforming herself into the creature of high society she had always longed to be. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her sit before her vanity. She applied her makeup with the meticulous, practiced hand of an artist working on a canvas, her expression intense and focused. She slipped into a backless gown of heavy black silk that pooled around her feet like dark water, the fabric catching the dim light of the bedroom. Finally, she opened the small velvet box I had found in her bag. She lifted the platinum sapphire collar, her fingers trembling slightly with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy, and fastened it around her neck. The deep blue stones gleamed against her pale skin, looking like cold, bruised eyes staring out at the world. She turned to me, her eyes bright with a desperate, glittering ambition, and asked how she looked. I forced my lips to curve into a warm, admiring smile, telling her she was absolutely breathtaking. It was the truth, but it was the beauty of a poisonous flower, designed to lure and destroy. I wore a simple, dark charcoal suit, the small encrypted flash drive resting in my breast pocket like a loaded weapon. The drive north to Astoria was a silent affair, the only sound the rhythmic, hypnotic sweep of the windshield wipers against the glass. The Sterling Gallery was situated at the very end of a historic pier, a massive, renovated warehouse of weathered cedar and glass that jutted out into the dark, churning waters of the Columbia River. As we approached, the headlights of luxury vehicles illuminated the rain-slicked asphalt, casting long, shimmering reflections of red and gold across the pier. Valets in heavy wool coats hurried back and forth, opening doors for women in furs and men in tailored tuxedos. When we stepped inside, the sheer scale of the event was staggering. The gallery was packed with hundreds of guests, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, damp wool, and the crisp, yeast-like aroma of champagne. Towering abstract sculptures of steel and glass rose from the polished concrete floor, illuminated by dramatic, narrow spotlights that cast sharp shadows against the high timber walls. A string quartet played a modern, discordant piece in the corner, their music blending with the low, continuous roar of polite conversation. Julianne was immediately swallowed by a group of wealthy patrons from Portland, her laughter ringing out clear and sharp over the din. I stepped back, letting the crowd close in front of me, content to become a ghost in her world of light and shadow. I spotted Carter Sterling near the center of the main exhibition hall, standing before a large-scale model of the proposed marina development. He looked every bit the successful, commanding developer, his charcoal suit immaculate, his posture radiating an easy, unearned confidence. But as I watched him from a distance, I noticed the subtle signs of decay. The slight tremor in his hand as he raised his wine glass, the faint, dark circles beneath his eyes, and the way his gaze constantly darted toward the entrance of the gallery as if expecting someone to walk through the doors and demand what was owed. When Julianne finally made her way toward him, the shift in their demeanor was subtle but undeniable. They did not touch, but the space between them seemed to shrink, their bodies aligning in a silent, instinctual harmony. They spoke in low, animated tones, their faces illuminated by the bright spotlights of the marina model. To the rest of the room, they were simply a talented curator and her wealthy patron, discussing the future of the city's waterfront. To me, they were two thieves standing in the wreckage of my life, celebrating their plunder. I checked my watch. It was 7:45. Across the city, the trap was springing shut. The courier services I had hired had already delivered the physical packages to the personal residences of the gallery's 7 board members, as well as the offices of the 2 major regional newspapers. The digital files, containing high-resolution copies of the bank statements, wire transfers, and the intimate photographs I had taken, were scheduled to be delivered to their personal email accounts in exactly 15 minutes. But the most important delivery was taking place at the Sterling estate in Gearhart. Eleanor Sterling, whose family's vast real estate fortune was the sole reason Carter had any standing in this town, had been led to believe her husband was attending a private, high-level investor meeting in Seattle. The package I had sent to her personal assistant contained not only the proof of Carter's infidelity but the exact ledger of how Julianne had been siphoning our joint funds to pay off his personal debts, effectively using my money to shield Carter from his wife's financial oversight. I knew Eleanor's pride would not allow her to suffer such a betrayal in silence. She was a woman who understood the language of power and public humiliation, and I had handed her the perfect weapon. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy glass double doors of the gallery swung open. The cool, damp wind from the river rushed into the warm room, carrying with it the scent of salt and rain. The chatter near the entrance began to die down, a sudden, heavy silence spreading through the crowd like a drop of ink in a glass of water. I turned my head toward the doors. Eleanor Sterling walked in, her presence immediately commanding the attention of the entire room. She was a tall, elegant woman of 58 years, her silver hair styled in a severe, perfect bob. She wore a tailored cream-colored cashmere coat that made her stand out like a beacon against the dark evening wear of the guests. She did not walk with the hurried pace of an angry spouse, she moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a monarch arriving to reclaim her court. Behind her walked 2 men in dark, identical suits carrying leather briefcases, and her personal attorney, a man whose reputation for ruthless asset protection was legendary in the state of Oregon. The crowd parted before Eleanor as she walked down the center aisle of the gallery, the rhythmic clicking of her heels on the polished concrete the only sound in the cavernous room. Carter, who had been laughing at a joke made by a city councilman, froze mid-sentence. His glass of champagne slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor with a sharp, ringing crack that seemed to echo off the cedar rafters. The golden liquid pooled around his expensive leather shoes, but he did not look down. His eyes were fixed on his wife, his face turning a sickly, ash-gray color. Julianne, standing a few feet away, took a sharp breath, her hand instinctively flying to her throat to clutch the sapphire collar as if it could somehow protect her from what was coming. Eleanor stopped 3 feet from them, her expression entirely devoid of warmth or anger. It was a face of absolute, icy indifference. She looked at Carter for a brief moment, then turned her gaze to Julianne, her eyes scanning the black silk gown and the glittering sapphire necklace with a look of profound, clinical disgust. Eleanor did not raise her voice, but in the dead silence of the gallery, her words carried to every corner of the room. She spoke with a cold, clear precision that cut through the air like a knife. She told Carter that his keys to their home had been changed, his access to all corporate accounts had been terminated, and that her legal team had already filed for a divorce that would invoke the full force of their prenuptial agreement, leaving him with nothing but his debts. Before Carter could speak, Eleanor turned to Julianne. She reached into her coat, pulled out a thick, white envelope, and threw it directly at Julianne's chest. The envelope struck her collarbone, bursting open and spilling dozens of glossy, high-resolution photographs and printed financial statements across the polished concrete floor. Several guests near the front of the crowd knelt down, their curiosity overcoming their politeness, and began picking up the papers. The images were unmistakable, Julianne and Carter in the shadows of the very gallery we stood in, their bodies joined in a desperate, secret embrace. Beneath the photographs were the bank records, clearly showing the $80,000 in wire transfers from our joint accounts to Carter's offshore shell company. The gallery erupted into a chaotic, deafening chorus of gasps, whispers, and the frantic clicking of smartphone cameras as the guests began sharing the images and documents. At that moment, 3 members of the gallery's board of directors, their faces grim and pale as they stared at the digital files on their own phones, stepped forward from the crowd. The chairman of the board, a wealthy shipping magnate who had been one of Julianne's most vocal supporters, looked at her with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He spoke in a loud, clear voice, informing her that her contract with the Sterling Gallery was terminated immediately for gross moral turpitude and financial misconduct, and that the board would be launching a full forensic audit of her past exhibitions to determine if any gallery funds had been compromised. Julianne stood frozen in the center of the room, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her in a matter of seconds. The black silk gown that had made her feel so powerful now looked like a shroud, and the sapphire collar around her neck seemed to choke her. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with terror and desperation, searching for a friendly face, but the very people who had been laughing and drinking with her moments before now turned their backs, whispering behind their hands. Finally, her gaze drifted through the crowd and locked onto mine. I was standing near the edge of the room, half hidden by the shadow of a massive steel sculpture, my hands in my pockets. I did not look angry, or hurt, or triumphant. I simply looked at her with the calm, detached curiosity of a builder inspecting a collapsed foundation. The realization of what I had done washed over her face in a wave of sudden, sickening clarity. She realized that the husband she had dismissed as simple, the man she believed was too blind to see her betrayal, had been the architect of her complete and total destruction. I slowly took my hand out of my pocket, reached for a glass of champagne from a passing waiter's tray, and raised it toward her in a silent, elegant toast. I held her gaze for 3 long seconds, watching the tears begin to well in her eyes, before taking a slow, deliberate sip. I set the glass down on a nearby pedestal, turned my back on the ruined exhibition, and walked out of the gallery into the cool, clean Oregon air, leaving her to face the wreckage of the life she had chosen to destroy. The drive back from Astoria to our coastal home was a journey through a dark, liquid void. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke with a savage intensity, throwing sheets of heavy, gray rain against the windshield of my truck. The headlights cut thin, fragile yellow tunnels through the blackness of Highway 101, illuminating the glistening trunks of the ancient hemlocks that lined the asphalt like silent, watchful sentinels. In the passenger seat, the silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that felt far more substantial than the air we breathed. I did not turn on the radio. I did not need the distraction. The rhythmic, mechanical sweep of the wipers and the deep, throbbing hum of the engine were the only sounds I required, a steady, predictable counterpoint to the chaotic storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. I felt a strange, hollow sort of peace settling into my bones, the kind of quiet exhaustion that comes only after a long, difficult structure has finally been demolished. The gallery had been a theater of public execution, and I had watched the curtain fall with the cold detachment of a spectator who already knew the ending of the play. When I finally pulled into our gravel driveway, the house sat dark and silent on the cliffside, its cedar siding glistening wetly in the headlights. I walked inside, the air smelling faintly of the jasmine perfume Julianne had worn the night before, a lingering ghost of a life that no longer existed. I did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I navigated the dark kitchen by memory, pouring myself 3 fingers of rye whiskey from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. I carried the glass to the window, watching the white foam of the Pacific breakers crash against the black basalt rocks 80 feet below. The house felt larger now, emptier, as if the removal of Julianne's secrets had sucked the very warmth from the walls. I knew she would not return that night. She was likely trapped in the wreckage of her own making, surrounded by the ruins of her career and the shattered pieces of Carter Sterling's reputation. I took a slow, burning sip of the whiskey, letting the alcohol dull the sharp edges of my exhaustion, and waited for the morning to bring the inevitable reckoning. It was nearly 10 o'clock the following morning when the quiet hum of a taxi engine broke the silence of the driveway. I was sitting at the kitchen island, a fresh mug of black coffee between my hands, when the front door clicked open. Julianne walked in, and the contrast between her appearance now and the radiant, untouchable woman of 12 hours ago was staggering. The black silk gown she had worn with such pride was wrinkled and stained at the hem with road grime and river water. Her hair, which had been styled with such geometric precision, was a tangled, damp nest around her pale, hollow face. The sapphire collar was gone, her bare neck looking strangely vulnerable and exposed in the harsh morning light. She did not scream, and she did not cry. She simply closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. She looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and a cold, burning hatred that seemed to radiate from her very skin. "You did this," she whispered, her voice raw and cracked from hours of silence or screaming. "You planned every single detail of it." I set my coffee mug down with deliberate precision, the ceramic clinking softly against the quartz countertop. I did not stand up. I did not want to offer her the dignity of a confrontation. I simply looked at her, my expression as neutral and unyielding as the concrete floors beneath our feet. I told her that I had not planned anything, that I had simply allowed the truth to find its own way into the light. I reminded her that she was the one who had spent the last 6 months siphoning $80,000 from our joint accounts to fund her lover's failing empire, and that she was the one who had chosen to turn our marriage into a performance of convenience. I told her that her choices had brought her to this point, and that I was merely the one who had refused to play the role of the blind, trusting fool any longer. Julianne took a step toward me, her hands clenching into tight, trembling fists. "You think you are so smart, Nick," she spat, her voice rising in pitch, trembling with a volatile mix of anger and desperation. "You think you have won because you embarrassed me in front of a few wealthy snobs. But you have no idea what you have done. You have destroyed my life, my career, everything I have worked for. Do you honestly think I am just going to let you walk away from this? Do you think I will let you keep this house, this business, while I am left with nothing?" I stood up slowly, using my height to dominate the space between us. I told her that she had 24 hours to pack her personal belongings and vacate the property. I informed her that my attorney, Arthur Vance, had already filed a petition for divorce in the county courthouse, citing egregious financial fraud and marital misconduct. I reminded her of the prenuptial agreement we had signed 7 years ago, which clearly stated that any proven financial misconduct or fraud would nullify her claim to my landscaping business and our shared assets. She had signed that document when she had nothing, and now, because of her own greed, she would leave with exactly the same amount. Her face went through a rapid succession of colors, settling finally on a pale, sickly green. She stared at me for a long, silent moment, her mind clearly working behind her eyes, searching for a crack in my defense, a weakness she could exploit. But she found nothing. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked down the hallway to our bedroom, the door slamming shut behind her with a force that rattled the glass in the kitchen cabinets. For the next 3 hours, the house was filled with the sounds of her packing, the violent scraping of hangers, the heavy thud of suitcases, and the muffled, angry tears of a woman who had realized, too late, that she had been playing checkers while her opponent was playing chess. When she finally left, dragging 2 heavy leather suitcases behind her, she did not look at me. She simply stepped out into the rain and into the waiting taxi, leaving me alone in the quiet sanctuary of my home. For the next 3 weeks, a strange, deceptive peace settled over my life. I threw myself into my work, spending 12 hours a day on a massive coastal restoration project in Cannon Beach. We were rebuilding a series of ancient stone retaining walls that had been damaged by the winter storms, a task that required absolute precision and immense physical strength. I found comfort in the heavy, unforgiving weight of the basalt rocks, the honest, simple mechanics of gravity and friction. In the evenings, I would return to the empty house, cook a simple dinner, and enjoy the quiet, uncomplicated silence of my own company. My attorney, Arthur, assured me that the divorce proceedings were moving forward smoothly. We had submitted the 3 binders of evidence, the bank statements, the wire transfers, the encrypted text messages, and the photographs, and the court had scheduled a preliminary hearing for the middle of November. We felt entirely secure in our position. The evidence of her financial fraud was overwhelming, and the law was clear. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, the countersuit arrived. I was at the Cannon Beach job site, supervising the placement of a 3-ton capstone, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Arthur. His voice, usually calm and reassuring, held a sharp, tense edge that immediately made my stomach tighten. He asked me to come to his office in downtown Portland immediately, refusing to give any details over the phone. I left my foreman in charge of the crew, washed the stone dust from my hands, and drove the 90 miles to the city in a state of growing unease. Arthur's office was located on the 12th floor of a historic brick building overlooking the Willamette River. When I walked in, I found him sitting at his large mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and 3 empty cups of coffee. He looked tired, his 65 years weighing heavily on his shoulders. Without a word, he slid a thick blue folder across the desk toward me. "Julianne has hired Evelyn Reed," Arthur said quietly, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his temples. I frowned, the name unfamiliar to me. "Who is Evelyn Reed?" "She is a partner at one of the largest family law firms in Seattle," Arthur explained, his voice grim. "She specializes in high-asset divorces, and she is known throughout the Pacific Northwest for her scorched-earth tactics. She doesn't just defend her clients, she systematically destroys the opposition. And she has found a massive, potentially fatal flaw in our case, Nick." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the legal jargon on the first page. It was a counterpetition, but it did not deny the allegations of infidelity or financial fraud. Instead, it shifted the entire focus of the litigation to a completely different arena. The document accused me of a systematic campaign of illegal wiretapping, computer fraud, and coercive control. Arthur leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes locking onto mine. "Nick, how exactly did you obtain the encrypted text messages and the bank records from Julianne's phone?" I felt a cold prickle of sweat break out along my spine. I told him the truth, the same truth I had kept hidden from everyone. I explained how I had waited until she was asleep, how I had gently taken her hand and pressed her thumb against the biometric sensor of her phone to unlock it, and how I had downloaded the data to a secure drive. Arthur closed his eyes and let out a long, slow sigh that sounded like air escaping a punctured tire. "Under Oregon state law, accessing a person's private electronic communications without their explicit, contemporaneous consent is a Class C felony," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It falls under the state's wiretapping and computer crime statutes. By using her biometric data while she was unconscious, you did not just violate her privacy, you committed a federal and state offense." "But she was stealing our money," I protested, my voice rising as a sudden, desperate panic began to claw at my chest. She was committing fraud. She was using my hard-earned money to pay off her lover's debts. Surely the court has to take that into account. Arthur shook his head slowly. The fruit of the poisonous tree, Nick. In a court of law, evidence obtained through illegal means is entirely inadmissible. Evelyn Reed is arguing that your entire case is built on a foundation of illegal surveillance and psychological abuse. She has filed a motion to suppress all of our financial evidence, the text messages, and the photographs. And if the judge grants that motion, we have nothing. I stared at him, the walls of the elegant office suddenly feeling very close and very small. The realization of what I had done washed over me in a wave of cold, sickening reality. In my desire to play the perfect game of chess, in my arrogance to orchestrate her complete and total destruction, I had stepped directly into a trap of my own making. I had violated the law, and now, the very system I had relied upon to protect me was being turned into a weapon to destroy me. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and Arthur spent the next 4 days working 80 hours to prepare a defense against the motion to suppress. But as I drove back to the coast that evening, the rain falling in a steady, relentless sheet against the glass, I knew that the ground beneath my feet had begun to slide. I had built my life on the belief that a solid foundation and attention to detail would always prevail, but I had forgotten the most basic rule of construction: if you dig too deep, the entire structure will collapse on top of you. Chapter 5. The weekend before the preliminary hearing was the longest 72 hours of my life. I spent those days on my knees in the wet sand of Cannon Beach, my fingers raw and bleeding from handling the cold, rough edges of 500-pound basalt blocks. My crew worked in silence, sensing the heavy, dark cloud that hung over me. They knew me as a man who measured twice and cut once, a man who believed that if you respected the materials, the structure would stand for a century. But as I hoisted those massive stones into place, leveling them against the relentless pull of the Pacific tide, I felt a sickening realization beginning to take root in my chest. In the physical world, gravity is honest. It does not lie, it does not hire expensive lawyers, and it does not care about your intentions. If your wall is straight and your footings are deep, the earth will hold. But the legal system, I was beginning to learn, was not built on the honest laws of physics. It was a shifting, treacherous swamp of semantics, where a single misstep could sink the most solid foundation. When Monday morning finally arrived, the weather was fittingly bleak. A thick, freezing fog had rolled in off the ocean, blanketing the historic streets of Astoria in a damp, gray shroud that muffled the sound of the foghorns out on the river. I met Arthur Vance in the lobby of the Clatsop County Courthouse at 8 o'clock. The building was a grand, neoclassical structure of gray stone and dark mahogany, its high ceilings echoing with the quiet, nervous murmurs of people whose lives were about to be decided by a stranger in a black robe. Arthur looked older than he had the week before, his shoulders slightly hunched beneath his wool overcoat, his eyes scanning the crowded hallway with a tense, guarded expression. He did not offer his usual reassuring smile. Instead, he simply patted my shoulder and led me through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 3. We took our seats at the defense table, and a few minutes later, the double doors at the back of the room opened. Julianne walked in, and my heart cold hardened at the sight of her. She was no longer the disheveled, defeated woman who had dragged her suitcases out of my house. Under the brilliant, ruthless direction of Evelyn Reed, she had been completely remade. She wore a modest, high-necked dress of dark charcoal wool, her hair pulled back into a neat, simple bun that emphasized the pale, delicate lines of her face. She looked fragile, quiet, and profoundly wronged. Beside her walked Evelyn Reed, a tall, striking woman with sharp, predatory eyes and a posture that radiated absolute, terrifying confidence. As they took their seats at the plaintiff's table, Julianne did not look at me. She kept her eyes cast down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, playing the role of the terrified, abused wife to absolute perfection. The clerk called our case, and the Honorable Thomas Morrison took his seat on the bench. He was a man of 72 years, with a crown of thin white hair and a face that looked as though it had been carved out of the very cliffs of Cape Disappointment. He had a reputation for being a strict constructionist, a traditionalist who demanded absolute decorum in his courtroom and held a deep, abiding respect for the letter of the law. He adjusted his reading glasses, looked down at the thick blue folders on his desk, and cleared his throat with a sound like dry gravel. "We are here this morning on a motion to suppress evidence filed by the plaintiff," Judge Morrison began, his deep, resonant voice filling the quiet room. "The defense has submitted a substantial amount of digital data, including financial records, text messages, and photographic evidence, which they argue proves egregious marital fraud and misconduct. The plaintiff argues that this evidence was obtained in direct violation of Oregon revised statutes regarding computer crime and wiretapping, and must be ruled inadmissible. Mr. Vance, you may proceed." Arthur stood up, smoothing the front of his suit jacket. He spoke with the quiet, measured dignity of a man who had practiced law in this state for 40 years. He argued that my actions, while unconventional, were born out of a desperate necessity to protect my life savings and the structural integrity of my business from a systematic, fraudulent conspiracy. He pointed out that Julianne had actively siphoned $80,000 of our joint funds to pay off the debts of her lover, Carter Sterling, and that my discovery of the phone data was the only way to halt the ongoing theft of our marital estate. He argued that the doctrine of equitable distribution must not be used to reward a spouse who had engaged in such blatant, criminal misconduct. But when Arthur sat down, Evelyn Reed stood up, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. She did not raise her voice, but every word she spoke was a cold, precise strike designed to dismantle our case piece by piece. "Your Honor, this is not a case of a husband protecting his assets," Reed began, her sharp eyes locking onto the judge. "This is a case of a controlling, paranoid man who engaged in a systematic campaign of domestic surveillance, digital stalking, and profound physical violation." Mr. Callahan did not simply stumble upon this information. He waited until my client was unconscious, in the privacy of her own bed, and he physically forced her limp hand onto her phone to bypass her biometric security. He violated her bodily autonomy while she slept. He then spent weeks secretly recording her, tracking her movements with a GPS device, and downloading her private, encrypted communications. And when he had what he wanted, he did not go to a court of law. He orchestrated a brutal, public shaming at her place of employment, destroying her career and her reputation in a single evening. This is the very definition of coercive control and psychological abuse. If this court allows this evidence to stand, it will send a message to every spouse in this state that they are free to violate the statutory privacy rights of their partners with absolute impunity. I sat at the table, my hands clenched into tight fists beneath the mahogany wood, my chest tightening with a sense of suffocating frustration. I wanted to stand up and scream that she was lying, that Julianne was the predator, that she was the one who had spent years treating our marriage as a financial playground. But I had to sit there in silence, watching the judge nod slowly as Reed spoke, his stern face darkening with every detail of my surveillance that she laid bare. The hearing proceeded with agonizing slowness. Evelyn Reed called Julianne to the stand, and I had to watch my wife weep softly as she described the terror of realizing she was being watched, how she felt unsafe in her own home, and how my cold, distant demeanor had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. She reframed her financial fraud as a desperate, confused attempt to help a friend, claiming she had always intended to replace the funds before I discovered the transfers. It was a brilliant, devastating performance, and as I looked at the judge's face, I knew we had lost. Judge Morrison took a long, heavy pause after the arguments concluded. He took off his reading glasses, rubbed his eyes, and looked down at us from the bench. His gaze lingered on me for several seconds, and there was no sympathy in his eyes. "The laws of this state regarding digital privacy and computer trespass are clear, and they do not contain an exception for suspicious spouses," the judge said, his voice flat and unyielding. "The court finds that the defendant, Nicholas Callahan, obtained the encrypted text messages, the financial records, and the photographic evidence through illegal, unauthorized access of the plaintiff's personal electronic device. The use of a sleeping person's biometric data to bypass security is a severe violation of privacy that this court cannot and will not condone. Therefore, the plaintiff's motion to suppress is granted." All digital evidence obtained from the phone is hereby ruled inadmissible in these proceedings. A cold, heavy numbness washed over me, a physical sensation of the floor dropping out from beneath my feet. But the judge was not finished. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, his voice growing even sterner, the court must address the validity of the prenuptial agreement. The defense has argued that the agreement's fraud clause should nullify the plaintiff's claims to the marital assets. However, a party seeking equity must come to this court with clean hands. The defendant's systematic campaign of illegal surveillance, culminating in a highly public, malicious attempt to destroy the plaintiff's reputation, constitutes egregious misconduct that invalidates his right to enforce the strict terms of the prenuptial agreement. The court hereby declares the prenuptial agreement unenforceable. We will proceed to the final division of assets under the standard laws of equitable distribution, taking into account the severe emotional and financial distress caused to the plaintiff by the defendant's actions. The gavel fell with a loud, wooden crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The hearing was over. I sat frozen in my chair, the muffled sounds of the courtroom swirling around me as Arthur Vance put a hand on my shoulder, his voice filled with a quiet, defeated apology. Across the room, Julianne stood up, wiping a dry tear from her cheek, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of her lips as she looked back at me. She had survived the collapse, and now, she was going to make me pay for every single stone I had laid. The 2 months that followed the preliminary hearing were a slow, freezing descent into a winter that seemed as though it would never end. In coastal Oregon, January does not merely bring cold, it brings a heavy, wet darkness that seeps into the wood of your home, into the joints of your bones, and into the very core of your thoughts. I spent those weeks living in a cramped, drafty rental cottage near the shipyards of Astoria, a place that smelled of damp wool and old kerosene. My evenings were no longer spent watching the sunset from the cedar deck I had built with my own hands. Instead, I sat at a small laminate table, surrounded by cardboard boxes of corporate tax records, bank statements, and legal correspondence, trying to find a way to save the business I had spent 15 years of my life constructing. But every path I mapped out led to the same cold, unyielding wall. The rumors of the lawsuit had already begun to circulate through the county, whispering through the local hardware stores and lumber yards like dry leaves in the wind. Longtime clients, people who had known me for a decade, suddenly found reasons to delay our projects, their voices tight and uncomfortable over the phone. They did not want to be associated with a man who was being accused of systematic domestic surveillance and psychological abuse by a wife who had once been the darling of the local art scene. When the morning of the final divorce decree arrived, the world outside was lost in a thick, freezing sleet that turned the streets of Astoria into sheets of black ice. I drove to the courthouse in silence, the heater in my truck blowing a dry, dusty warmth that did nothing to ease the deep, cold ache in my chest. Courtroom 3 was already quiet when Arthur Vance and I took our seats at the defense table. The room was a sterile expanse of dark, polished oak paneling, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a pale, institutional glare over the empty spectator benches. The air smelled of floor wax, wet umbrellas, and the faint, sweet scent of the jasmine perfume that Julianne still wore. She sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Evelyn Reed, her posture so upright and elegant that she looked like a marble statue carved for a cathedral. She wore a simple, high-necked dress of dark navy wool, her face pale and entirely devoid of makeup, her eyes fixed on the small wooden crucifix mounted on the wall behind the judge's bench. She did not look at me, not even when I sat down just 10 feet away from her. She had been taught her role well, and she played the victim with a quiet, devastating grace that made my chest tighten with a familiar, useless rage. The Honorable Thomas Morrison took his seat on the bench at precisely 10 o'clock. He did not look at either of us as he adjusted his spectacles and opened the thick, leather-bound ledger containing his final judgment. When he spoke, his voice was flat, measured, and entirely devoid of emotion, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years watching the wreckage of human lives pass before his eyes and had long since ceased to care about the details. This court has spent the past several weeks reviewing the evidence and testimony presented by both parties, Judge Morrison began, his words echoing softly off the high timber ceiling. While the defendant has presented a narrative of marital infidelity and financial misconduct on the part of the plaintiff, the court cannot ignore the egregious, illegal methods used to obtain the primary evidence supporting these claims. Under the statutes of this state, the right to privacy within a marriage is not a conditional privilege that can be suspended at the whim of a suspicious spouse. The defendant's actions in accessing the plaintiff's personal electronic device while she was unconscious, tracking her movements with a global positioning system, and secretly recording her conversations constitute a severe, systematic invasion of privacy and a form of coercive control that this court finds deeply disturbing. I felt Arthur's hand tighten on my forearm, a silent warning to keep my face neutral, but the blood was already rushing to my ears with a deafening, roaring sound. I stared at the judge, my hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table until my knuckles turned white. Consequently, the judge continued, his eyes finally rising to lock onto mine with a cold, administrative severity. The prenuptial agreement executed by the parties on the 12th of October, 7 years ago, is hereby declared null and void. The court finds that the defendant's unlawful conduct and subsequent public dissemination of the illegally obtained materials have caused irreparable damage to the plaintiff's professional career, her standing in the community, and her emotional well-being. We will proceed with an equitable distribution of the marital estate that reflects the severity of this harm. The judge turned a page in his ledger, and with a few short, precise sentences, he systematically dismantled the foundation of my life. The real property located on the cliffside in Gearhart, valued at $1,200,000, is awarded entirely to the plaintiff, Julianne Callahan, free and clear of any claim by the defendant. The defendant is ordered to vacate the property immediately and is barred from entering the premises. Furthermore, the court has conducted a valuation of the defendant's landscaping business, Callahan Landscaping and Design, and values the enterprise at $900,000. The plaintiff is awarded a lump sum payment representing 40% of the business's value, totaling $360,000, payable to the plaintiff within 90 days of this decree. Finally, to mitigate the loss of the plaintiff's career and to maintain her established standard of living, the defendant is ordered to pay spousal support in the amount of $6,500 per month for a period of 7 years. The gavel fell with a sharp, hollow crack that sounded like the snapping of a dry pine branch. The court is adjourned, the judge said, standing up and disappearing through the private door behind the bench before the echo of the gavel had even died away. I sat frozen in my seat, the silence of the courtroom pressing down on me like a physical weight. $360,000 in 90 days. It was an impossible sum, a number that would force me to sell my excavators, my trucks, and the very tools I had used to build my business. I would have to lay off Frank and the rest of my crew, the men who had stood by me when the rumors started, the men who had families of their own to feed. The house on the cliff, the home where I had poured my sweat into every cedar plank and concrete footer, was no longer mine. I would have to pay my wife $6,500 every month for 84 months, a permanent anchor dragging me down into a sea of debt, while she lived in the house I built, funded by the very sweat of my brow. Arthur Vance leaned over, his voice a quiet, defeated whisper. I am sorry, Nick. Morrison is a traditionalist. He was never going to look past the biometric bypass. In his eyes, you committed a crime to prove a point, and the law simply doesn't allow for that. We can file an appeal, but it will cost another $50,000, and the chances of a reversal are slim to none. I did not answer him. I stood up, my joints stiff and aching, and began packing my papers into my leather briefcase. Across the room, Julianne was already standing, her coat draped elegantly over her arm. She was listening to Evelyn Reed speak, nodding with a quiet, modest satisfaction that made my stomach turn. She did not look at me as she walked toward the double doors of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly on the polished wood, her posture as perfect and unyielding as it had been when she entered. I walked out of the courtroom and down the grand marble staircase of the courthouse, my boots heavy on the stone. When I pushed open the heavy brass double doors and stepped out onto the wide stone steps, the freezing sleet hit my face like a handful of tiny, sharp needles. The sky was a dark, bruised purple, and the cold wind off the Columbia River carried the bitter smell of salt, wet asphalt, and diesel exhaust. I stopped near the top of the steps, pulling my collar up against the wind, and watched as Julianne walked down ahead of me. She moved with a slow, confident grace, her head held high, the sleek glistening in her dark hair like a crown of tiny diamonds. At the curb, idling softly in the gray light, was a sleek, black Mercedes-Benz that I had never seen before. The passenger door opened, and a man stepped out into the rain, holding a large black umbrella. It was Carter Sterling. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable developer he had been before the exhibition. His face was thinner, his eyes guarded, and he wore a simple wool coat instead of his usual tailored designer suits. He had been stripped of his family's trust and his partnership by his wife, Eleanor, but as he looked up at Julianne, there was no anger in his eyes. There was only a quiet, desperate gratitude. Julianne's new fortune, the 40% of my business, the monthly alimony, and the $1 million coastal home, was more than enough to rescue him from his debts and fund the luxurious, comfortable life they had always wanted to share. Julianne paused on the bottom step, just a few feet from the open door of the luxury car. She turned her head slowly, her gaze drifting up the stone steps until her eyes locked onto mine. The cold, pale light of the winter morning caught the sharp lines of her face, and for a brief, agonizing second, the mask of the fragile, abused wife slipped away. She looked at me, her eyes bright with a cruel, triumphant intelligence, and her lips curved into a slow, victorious smirk. It was the look of a woman who had stood on the edge of a cliff, watched the ground crumble beneath her feet, and somehow found a way to fly, using my own wings to carry her. She stepped into the passenger seat, and Carter closed the door behind her with a solid, expensive thud. He walked around to the driver's side, got in, and the black car pulled away from the curb, its red taillights disappearing into the thick, freezing fog of the Astoria morning. I stood alone on the stone steps, the sleet soaking through my wool coat, my hands trembling with a mixture of cold and a deep, hollow rage that felt as vast and empty as the winter ocean. I had spent months planning the perfect revenge, measuring every angle, calculating every force, and waiting for the precise moment to let the structure fall. I had believed that the truth would be my shield, that the simple, honest facts of her betrayal would be enough to set me free. But I had forgotten that in the world of men, the rules are not written by builders. They are written by lawyers, by judges, and by people who care far more about the sanctity of the process than the honesty of the foundation. In my arrogance, I had believed I was playing a game of chess, but I had been playing on a board that was rigged from the very beginning, and the final move had belonged to her. I turned my collar down against the wind, stepped off the stone stairs, and walked into the freezing rain, a free man with nothing left but the clothes on my back and the bitter, permanent knowledge of how completely I had been destroyed by the very rules I thought would save me.